And welcome to this overview of Chapter 8. Chapter 8 discusses epigenetics, but before we go on to Chapter 8, I wanted to do a quick review and recap of Chapter 7. If you've watched a video recording of Chapter 7 lecture, you've heard some of this, but I just want to recap a couple key components. So in Chapter 7, we talked about a few different multi-level models, including Braun-Fenn-Brenner's bioecological systems theory. The idea that we as humans, and of course, Braun-Fenn-Brenner was a child psychologist, so children, but we as humans are influenced by direct or proximal interactions, as well as more distant or outside interactions, such as an interaction between our parent and our teacher. Those are distal interactions. And so we're influenced by our microsystem, the people that directly interact with us, as well as the interactions between those parties, the mesosystem, the broader community, the exosystem, and then the macrosystem, including public policy and things like structural racism, and then the chronosystem, changes in those environments over time. And so the idea that our behavior can be influenced by all these environments and that health behavior interventions can occur at different levels or across different sectors in this model. And so we took a look at that model in Chapter 7, looking at the interactions and how complicated that model can be, because the way that we interact with our parents and our colleagues and our friend groups might be different, and the way that each of those individuals interact and what it takes to make a good day for one person versus a bad day for another, how our attitudes and expectancies and belief systems can change over time based on all of these many interactions and the resources in our communities, right? It just becomes very complicated and interactive. We also talked briefly about Flay's theory of triadic influence and how Brian Flay wanted to really understand youth risk behavior. And so he looked at cultural environments, social situations, and personal factors together, those three levels of influences. And he also looked at ultimate, broad, huge influences that impact us all, proximal, things that are very close to us, and distal, right? Those externalities, those factors that impact us over time, but maybe aren't direct. Looked at all those factors together. And so this is that model, if you remember, looking at how social context, what we believe is normal and okay and acceptable in society, our attitudes towards behavior based on our culture and our environment, and then of course our own personality and our own biology come together to impact our decisions, our intentions that over time impact our behavior. And so this is that TTI, or theory of triadic influence. And then this, if you remember, is a more in-depth view of that model. Now, if you remember, the last theory we talked about in Chapter 7 was the integrated behavior model. And I said this is really kind of an upgraded version of the theory of planned behavior, adding in outside influences. This viewpoint looks at attitude, perceived norms, and our own self-efficacy, perceived agency, and control of our lives, all three of those impacting our intentions. But our intentions aren't the only thing that lead to behavior. We have to have knowledge. We have to believe the behavior is important. It has to be salient. It has to be valuable. It has to be at the tip of our brain, something we really care about. The environmental constraints, of course, the environment has to be right for that change to happen, and we have to be able to form a habit in most cases in order to sustain a behavior. So those four factors also impact health behavior, in addition to just our intention and decision that is formed from our attitudes, perceived norms, and sense of control, perceived agency. So this is our last group theory. And so if some of this is sounding strange to you, go back and listen to the lecture from Chapter 7. But I just wanted to go back through those series one more time so we have those fresh in our mind. Now, epigenetics is a little bit different. This chapter is very different from the other chapters we cover in this course, because epigenetics is all about what makes humans what we are, what they are, and do what we do, human behavior. And so the basic question is, how does our genetics, our species, being who we are, the genotypes and epigenotypes, influence who we are? Now, I am not a geneticist, so I am not an expert in the area of clinical science around us, but I understand that the environment impacts the expression of our genes, and impacts the way that our genes are copied and the way that they're expressed in each of us and then in our children. I understand that. And I also understand that because of that, epigenetics is this new emerging field that looks at the expression of genes and how our environment, how our access to healthy food and air and water and the chemicals we consume, how all of that impacts how healthy our bodies are and our ability to pass down healthy traits and continue to grow as a species. Now, epigenetics itself, oops, sorry. I apologize. PowerPoint really wants to skip this slide today. Looks at the interaction process that occurs, almost like a switch that turns lights on and off. So individuals have a genetic inheritance or a genotype that's passed down. The genotype is the actual genetic information, but the actual expression of those genes in an individual is then called a phenotype. And most of you know that. So the genotype is the mutations, the structural variants, but the phenotype is the way it's expressed and seen in an organism or a cell. So whether or not genes in someone's genotype are activated and to what extent determine the expression. And the environment, social, physical, behavioral, everything around us can influence the way that our genes are expressed, can influence that phenotype. And we refer to that as the exposome, the way that our genes are expressed in a developing fetus. Now, this gene environment interaction is what we call epigenetics, how the environment impacts the expression of our genes and how they actually come to life, what we actually see as far as our health, our behavior, our development. And these are some epigenetic mechanisms. So this is the expression of our DNA, looking at things like cancer, autoimmune diseases, mental health, all of that is impacted by the environment. And so we have to realize that it's not just we inherit something and it is what it is. No, the environment that you're in dictates the way that those genes are expressed. And every story is a little bit different, but we can start by thinking about the epigenetic process of copying of genes. So genes are composed, as you know, segments of DNA and all the associated proteins. And for a gene to be copied and expressed, that DNA segment has to be read through a developmental process. And so RNA does that reading and it binds to the DNA and copies the genetic sequence. But sometimes things can interfere with that copying and can affect whether or not the genetic sequence is read correctly or not. And so this includes the DNA methylation, the histone or chromatin modification, and the acetylation. Again, not a scientist. I work on the behavioral side, but the processes are very intricate. And so the environment can impact how those genes are expressed. And this is where we see nature and nurture come together, which leads us to the next slide, behavioral genetics. The idea that stress and trauma and aggression impact the way our genes are expressed, impact the way that we develop. And there can be many causal factors that come together and impact us. So this is one more component in that broader socio-ecological model that we look at, is how even our genes and the way that they're expressed in phenotypes is impacted by the world around us, is impacted by the opportunity we have. And so this is something really important to remember, but also an area where we can work with clinical scientists and individuals on the medical side to intervene in different ways. And this is a great article from Frontiers. Take a look at that if you're interested. Frontiers in Public Health has some fascinating articles and work on the public health side. They also have multiple affiliated journals on the clinical science side, but this gives you a good overview too if you click on that link. So when we think about behavioral epigenetics and we think about health disparities, we know that health disparities occur when communities and populations are exposed to high levels of environmental factors, injustice, something that creates a gap in opportunity. And this can happen even from a genetic perspective. And we call this, or could call it, a disparity exposome. The idea that the way that someone's genetics are expressed is impacted by their environment, and that itself is a health risk. And so if we want to mitigate that, right, we have to create healthy environments for people to grow, live, work, play, but especially that maternal process, pregnancy and early childhood development, and think about how we transmit genetic information and how can we protect that process from stress and trauma. Now, one way that we can intervene is prevention of epigenetic risk conditions. So if we alleviate poverty, if we provide good early childhood care and education, if we reduce unhealthy environmental exposures, that lessens the likelihood of risk conditions occurring that could affect the expression of genetics. We also, although there's very few models that exist, could create health promotion programs that look at reversing epigenetic changes. Now, that isn't always an easy thing to do, right? But the idea of intervening in situations where violence exists, in trying to turn back the clock a little bit, reset, heal some of that. And then we have a third category called mitigation, which looks at social support and what we can do, protective factors to insulate from things that we weren't able to prevent. So we've got prevention, we've got treatment essentially, but looking at reversing those changes. And then we have protective factors, putting things in place that might lessen the negative impact of what we weren't able to prevent. So I hope that gives you a quick overview. Again, I've got a couple slides here at the end, just reminders of your upcoming assignments, right? So you've got your community health profile coming due. Don't forget about that. That's a group assignment to focus on a few health issues in the community you've chosen to study for your final project. This will help you really narrow down your topic that you'll then use to prepare your group presentation and your final theory-driven community health behavior intervention plan. Please reach out to me as you're meeting and working with your groups. I am glad to review drafts. I am glad to help out along the way. All right. All right. Well, I hope that was helpful. I tried to keep it short and brief, but reach out with questions. Thanks, everybody. Have a great week.